It was a quiet Sunday evening, the kind of night where you could almost forget the world's troubles for a moment. I had just finished cleaning up after dinner when I heard the knock at the door. It wasn't the usual soft tap of a neighbor dropping by. This was urgent, almost frantic. My heart skipped a beat as I wiped my hands on a dish towel and made my way to the door. Standing on the front steps was Emily, a woman I hadn't seen in years. Her eyes were red-rimmed from crying, her face pale under the porch light. In her arms, she clutched a small child, no older than 4, who rested his head on her shoulder, fast asleep. Her coat hung loosely off her frame, and even in the dim light, I could tell she had been through something terrible. "Michael, I didn't know where else to go," she said, her voice trembling. For a second, I couldn't find my words. Memories of our shared childhood flickered through my mind. Summers by the lake, laughter echoing through the woods behind our houses. But this was a far cry from those carefree days. What happened? I finally managed, stepping aside to let her in. "Come inside. It's freezing." She nodded and stepped into the warmth of the house. The little boy stirred but didn't wake as I led her to the living room. I grabbed a blanket from the couch and gently draped it over her shoulders. "Sit down. Let me get you some tea," I offered, trying to buy myself a moment to process what was happening. As the kettle boiled, my mind raced. Emily had always been strong, the kind of person who faced every challenge head-on. Seeing her like this, shaken and vulnerable, set off every alarm in my head. Something was very wrong. When I returned with 2 mugs of tea, she was still sitting on the edge of the couch, clutching the blanket tightly around herself. "Thank you," she whispered, taking the cup with trembling hands. I sat down across from her. "Emily, what's going on? Why are you here?" She took a deep breath, her eyes welling up with tears. "He left," she said simply. "Matthew. He walked out on us. No warning, no explanation. He just left." The words hung in the air like a dark cloud. I struggled to wrap my head around them. Matthew had always seemed like the perfect husband, charming, dependable, the kind of man who made people feel at ease. But now, as I looked at the pain etched into Emily's face, I realized how little I actually knew about their life. "I'm so sorry," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "How long?" "3 weeks," she replied, her voice cracking. "I tried to manage on my own, but the rent's overdue, and there's no money left. I didn't know where else to go." I leaned forward, placing a hand on her arm. "You did the right thing coming here. You're not alone in this." Her eyes met mine, filled with a mixture of relief and uncertainty. "I didn't want to be a burden." "You're not a burden," I assured her. "You and your little one can stay as long as you need. We'll figure this out together." For the first time that night, a tear slipped down her cheek. "Thank you, Michael. You have no idea how much that means to me." I gave her a reassuring nod, even as my mind churned with questions. What had driven Matthew to abandon his family? What kind of man just walks away like that? But I pushed those thoughts aside for now. Emily needed rest, not an interrogation. As I helped her settle the little boy into the spare room, I felt a deep resolve take root in my chest. This was more than just an old friend needing a place to stay. Fate had brought Emily to my door for a reason. And somehow, I knew that this was just the beginning of a journey that would change all our lives. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee and the soft clinking of dishes from the kitchen. For a brief moment, it felt like everything was normal, like this was just a regular morning. But as I walked down the hallway and saw Emily standing by the stove, wearing the same clothes as last night, the weight of everything came rushing back. "Morning," I said softly, not wanting to startle her. She turned, offering a tired smile. "I hope you don't mind. I found the coffee and thought I'd make some for us." "Of course not," I replied, taking a seat at the table. "How'd you sleep?" Her eyes flicked toward the door to the spare room. "Better than I have in weeks, thank you." "Lucas, too. He's still asleep?" I nodded, watching her closely. She had always been graceful, but now there was a heaviness in her movements, like she was carrying a world of worry on her shoulders. "Emily, what really happened with Matthew?" I asked gently. "If you don't want to talk about it, that's fine. But if you do, I'm here." Her hands tightened around the coffee mug, and for a long moment, she didn't say anything. Then, with a deep breath, she finally spoke. It wasn't sudden. Not really, she said quietly. He started pulling away months ago. First, it was small things, working late, forgetting family plans. Then it escalated. I thought it was stress, until I found out he'd been lying about where he was. There was someone else? The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I didn't know what I'd expected her to say, but it certainly wasn't that. I confronted him, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't deny it. He just packed a bag and left that night. No apologies. No explanations. Just gone. My fists clenched under the table, anger rising in my chest. How could anyone be so cold, so heartless? To abandon his wife and child without a second thought? I don't know what I'm supposed to do now, she admitted, her voice breaking. I tried to find a job, but without references, it's been impossible. The landlord's already given me an eviction notice, and the last of our savings went to groceries. I couldn't let Lucas see me fall apart. You're not falling apart, I said firmly. You're still standing. That's what matters. You've been fighting every single day for him, and that takes more strength than most people will ever understand. Her eyes glistened with tears, but she nodded, holding herself together with an iron will. I'm just scared, Michael. What if it's not enough? I leaned forward, locking eyes with her. Then you lean on me. We'll figure this out, one step at a time. You're not alone in this anymore. Her shoulders sagged in relief, and for the first time, I saw a spark of hope return to her eyes. Before I could say anything else, the soft patter of footsteps interrupted us. Lucas stood in the doorway, rubbing his eyes with one hand and clutching a stuffed rabbit in the other. His hair was a wild mess, and his face was still half asleep. "Mommy," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. Emily rushed over and scooped him up, her face lighting up in a way that made my chest tighten. "Hey, sweetheart, did you sleep well?" He nodded, burying his face in her shoulder. "Lucas," she said gently, turning him toward me. "This is Michael. He's an old friend of Mommy's, and we're going to be staying here for a little while." I smiled, giving him a little wave. "Hey, buddy. Nice to meet you." Lucas blinked at me with wide, curious eyes before hiding his face again. "Shy one, huh?" I chuckled. "That's okay. You'll warm up eventually." Emily smiled, but before she could respond, a loud knock echoed from the front door, making all three of us freeze. "Are you expecting someone?" she asked, her voice tense. "No," I said, standing up slowly. My heart pounded as I made my way to the door. The knock came again, harder this time. When I opened it, I found a man standing on the porch. He looked vaguely familiar, tall, well-dressed, with an air of authority that immediately put me on edge. His eyes scanned the house behind me before locking onto mine. "Mr. Harper?" he asked, his voice clipped and professional. "That's me," I said warily. "Can I help you?" He held out a business card. "My name is David Mitchell. I'm a lawyer representing Matthew Whitaker. I'm here to discuss some urgent matters concerning your guests." I blinked, my stomach sinking. What kind of urgent matters? He gave me a tight smile. "May I come in?" The air seemed to thicken around us as I stepped aside and let David Mitchell into the house. His polished shoes clicked softly on the floor, his eyes scanning the living room with the precision of someone used to sizing things up quickly. Emily stood near the kitchen, clutching Lucas protectively, her face pale. "I'll keep this brief," he said, turning toward Emily. "Matthew sent me to deliver some important documents regarding your situation." "My situation?" Emily's voice was barely above a whisper, but there was steel beneath her words. "Matthew hasn't spoken to me in weeks. Now he's sending a lawyer?" Mitchell reached into his briefcase and handed her a thick envelope. "Matthew has filed for full custody of Lucas." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. I couldn't have heard him right. Emily's eyes went wide, and she clutched the envelope like it might burn her fingers. "What? That's impossible. He abandoned us. He hasn't even tried to see Lucas. He doesn't care." Mitchell's face remained unreadable. "Regardless of how you feel, he's claiming that he's more financially stable and can provide a better life for the child. His case is already in motion. A cold knot formed in my stomach. This wasn't just an idle threat. It was a calculated move. Emily's voice trembled, but her grip on Lucas tightened. He left us with nothing. He's only doing this because he knows how vulnerable we are right now. Mitchell raised an eyebrow, as though waiting for her to finish. It's my duty to advise you to cooperate. Fighting this will be expensive, to say the least. I suggest you consider what's best for Lucas. My blood boiled. I couldn't believe the audacity of this man, or Matthew, for that matter. He'd walked out on his family and left them to fend for themselves, and now he had the gall to come back and act like he cared? Consider what's best for Lucas? I said, stepping forward. What's best for him is staying with the mother who's been fighting tooth and nail for him, not being thrown into the care of someone who couldn't be bothered to stick around in the first place. Mitchell turned his cool gaze on me. And you are? An old friend, I said sharply, and someone who won't stand by and let this happen. For the first time, Mitchell's composed mask slipped just a little. His eyes narrowed slightly, calculating. Noted, he said after a pause. But the courts don't rely on personal opinions. If this goes to trial, the judge will look at the facts, income, stability, resources. I crossed my arms, holding his gaze. Then you'd better be ready to explain why a man who abandoned his child is suddenly so concerned with stability. Mitchell didn't answer. Instead, he glanced back at Emily. You have 2 weeks to respond. I'd recommend finding a lawyer if you intend to contest this. Good day, Ms. Whitaker. With that, he turned and walked out the door, leaving a suffocating silence in his wake. Emily sank onto the couch, still holding Lucas close. Her hands shook as she opened the envelope and pulled out the documents. This can't be happening, she whispered. He can't just take him away from me, can he? I sat beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. Not without a fight. And if it's a fight he wants, then he's going to get one. Her eyes filled with tears, but this time there was a spark of determination behind them. I won't lose him, Michael. I can't. You won't, I promised. We'll find a way. But even as I said it, a sinking feeling settled in my chest. Matthew had the money, the connections, and now the legal system on his side. We were walking into a battle that felt impossible to win. Still, there was one thing Matthew didn't count on: Emily's strength. And I'd be there with her every step of the way. The next few days passed in a blur of phone calls and frantic planning. I spent hours researching family lawyers, while Emily tried to stay calm for Lucas's sake. It wasn't easy. Every knock at the door sent her heart racing, and every ring of the phone brought fresh anxiety. Lucas, thankfully, was blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around him. He spent his days playing with the few toys we could scrounge up and helping me in the garden, his tiny hands digging eagerly in the dirt. His laughter echoed through the yard, a stark contrast to the tension hanging in the air inside. We need a lawyer, I said one afternoon, sitting across from Emily at the kitchen table. Not just any lawyer, a good one. Someone who can go toe-to-toe with Matthew's legal team. Emily nodded, biting her lip. But how are we supposed to afford that? Lawyers like that cost a fortune. We'll figure it out, I said, though I had no idea how. There's no price too high when it comes to keeping Lucas with you. We'll find a way. She glanced down at her hands, her voice barely a whisper. What if we lose? I reached across the table, covering her hands with mine. We won't. Not as long as we keep fighting. I could see the flicker of doubt in her eyes, but she nodded. You're right. For Lucas, we'll do whatever it takes. It wasn't long before I found someone who came highly recommended, a lawyer named Julia Grant. She was known for her no-nonsense approach and her willingness to take on tough cases. When we walked into her office, she greeted us with a sharp, assessing look. I've read through the basics of your case, she said, motioning for us to sit. It's not going to be easy. Your ex-husband has significant resources, and the courts do tend to favor financial stability. Emily's shoulders tensed, but Julia held up a hand. That doesn't mean we can't win. You've been Lucas's primary caregiver. We'll build a case that shows how much he needs you, and we'll prove that Matthew's sudden interest in custody is nothing more than a selfish power play. A flicker of hope lit up Emily's face. You really think we have a chance? Julia leaned back in her chair, a confident smile tugging at the corner of her lips. I wouldn't have taken your case if I didn't. For the first time in days, Emily exhaled deeply, like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. We'll need to gather as much evidence as possible, Julia continued. Anything that shows Matthew's absence, his lack of involvement, and how well Lucas is doing with you. Witness statements, photos, everything. I can help with that, I said, determination tightening my voice. Good, Julia replied. The more support we have, the stronger our case will be. But be prepared. Matthew's lawyer will come at you with everything they've got. This isn't going to be a fair fight. I nodded, glancing at Emily. We're ready. But deep down, I couldn't ignore the gnawing fear that this fight would push us further than we were prepared to go. It didn't take long for things to escalate. A few days after our meeting with Julia, we found a note slipped under the front door. No envelope, no signature. Just a single sheet of paper with 4 chilling words written in bold black ink. Drop the case. Now. I froze, my pulse quickening. Emily stood beside me, her face draining of color as she read the note. Do you think Matthew sent this? She whispered. I clenched my jaw. It's possible. Or someone who's working with him. Lucas's voice called from the living room, breaking the tense silence. Mommy, can we go to the park? Emily forced a smile, folding the note and slipping it into her pocket. Of course, sweetheart. Just give me a second. As soon as Lucas wandered back into the other room, Emily turned to me, her voice low and urgent. Michael, what do we do? We don't back down, I said firmly. Whoever sent that note is trying to scare us, but we can't let them. We'll tell Julia about it and make sure it's documented. If they want to fight, they've got one. Emily nodded, her jaw tightening with resolve. Lucas is my whole world. I won't let anyone take him from me. Then we stand our ground, I said. Together. The days that followed were a blur of strategy meetings with Julia, late-night conversations with Emily, and countless moments where we second-guessed everything. The note had rattled both of us, but we kept moving forward. We didn't have a choice. Lucas, innocent and unaware, brought light to our darkest moments. His laughter, the way his eyes lit up over pancakes, and his quiet determination to make us smile carried us through. But beneath every moment of peace, there was the hum of tension, like a storm waiting to break. Then, it did. One night, I returned from the grocery store to find Emily sitting on the couch, staring at her phone with a look of pure shock. Her hands were trembling, her face as pale as a ghost. Emily, what's wrong? I asked, setting the bags down. She handed me the phone without a word. On the screen was an email from Matthew's lawyer. It was a direct threat, veiled under legal language, but the message was clear. Withdraw the case or your past will become public. Her past. What is this? I asked, my chest tightening. Emily swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. Before I met Matthew, I made some mistakes. Nothing illegal, but things that could be twisted to make me look bad. He's going to use it against me. I sat beside her, gripping her hands. Whatever it is, it doesn't change who you are now. They can't scare you into silence. But what if they can? She said, tears pooling in her eyes. What if it costs me Lucas? We're not giving up, I promised. We'll face it head on. Together. The next day, we met with Julia and told her everything. She listened carefully, her sharp mind already working on a counter-strategy. Matthew's team will definitely bring this up in court, she said. But we'll spin it in your favor. Everyone has a past. What matters is that you've built a stable, loving home for Lucas. Emily nodded, wiping her eyes. I just don't want him to be dragged into this mess. That's why we'll stay one step ahead, Julia assured her. Trust me, Emily, you're not fighting this alone. The court date loomed closer, and the tension became almost unbearable. Every day brought new challenges, documents we had to prepare, people we had to convince to testify on Emily's behalf. Matthew's team fought dirty, leaking rumors and planting seeds of doubt wherever they could. But Emily never wavered. Then, something unexpected happened. It was 2 days before the trial when a knock came at the door. This time, it wasn't a threat. It was help. A woman in her late 50s stood on the porch. She introduced herself as Margaret, an old friend of Matthew's family who had heard about the custody battle. "I couldn't stay silent," she said, her voice filled with regret. "I've known Matthew for years. He's not the man he pretends to be. If you'll let me, I'd like to testify on your behalf." Emily's eyes filled with tears. "Why are you helping us?" Margaret smiled sadly. "Because I know what it's like to be pushed into a corner. No mother should have her child taken away for the wrong reasons." The day of the hearing arrived, and we walked into the courthouse with our heads held high. Julia led the charge, presenting a strong, compassionate case. Emily spoke from the heart, telling the judge how much she loved Lucas, how hard she had fought to give him a happy life. Julia countered every one of Matthew's accusations with calm precision, while Margaret's testimony revealed truths about Matthew's character that no amount of legal maneuvering could hide. When it was Matthew's turn to speak, his mask of charm cracked. His arrogance, his refusal to admit fault, it all worked against him. The judge listened carefully, his face giving away nothing. When the final gavel fell, the room seemed to hold its breath. "I've made my decision," the judge said. "Lucas will remain in the custody of his mother." Emily gasped, covering her mouth with both hands. Tears streamed down her face as she hugged Lucas tightly. I felt a surge of relief, so strong it left me dizzy. We'd done it. We'd won. Life began to settle after that. The battle was behind us, but it had left its mark. Still, Emily and Lucas seemed lighter, freer. One afternoon, as we sat on the porch watching Lucas chase fireflies, Emily turned to me with a soft smile. "I couldn't have done this without you, Michael." "You could have," I said, returning her smile. "But I'm glad you didn't have to." Her eyes held mine for a moment longer than usual. Something unspoken passed between us, a warmth, a gratitude deeper than words. "I don't know what the future holds," she said quietly, "but I know I'm not scared anymore." "Neither am I," I replied. Months later, life had found its rhythm again. Emily had a new job at a local community center, and Lucas was thriving in school. The house felt alive, filled with laughter and light. Then, one morning, another knock came at the door. This time, it wasn't a threat, a lawyer, or an unexpected visitor. It was an opportunity, a letter from a publishing house offering Emily a chance to write about her story. "It's too wild to be true," she laughed, holding up the letter. "Who'd want to read about all this?" "Anyone who believes in second chances," I said, "and in people brave enough to fight for what matters most." She looked at me with that same spark of determination I had seen on the hardest days. "Then maybe it's time to share it." As we stood there, the future wide open before us, I realized something. Sometimes life knocks you down. Sometimes it pushes you into corners you never expected to face. But every now and then, life gives you something else, a second chance, a new beginning. And if you're lucky, you find the people who'll stand beside you through every twist of fate.